2.
Yeah, first 11 verses of Joshua 2. Then Joshua the son of Nun sent 2 men as spies secretly from Shittim, saying, "Go view the land, especially Jericho." So they went and came into the house of a harlot whose name was Rahab, and lodged there. And it was told the king of Jericho, "Behold, men from the sons of Israel have come here tonight to search out the land." And the king of Jericho sent word to Rahab, saying, "Bring out the men that have come to you, who have entered your house, for they have come to search out all the land." But the woman had taken the 2 men and hidden them, and she said, "Yes, the men came to me, but I didn't know where they were from. And it came about when it was time to shut the gate at dark, the men went out. I do not know where the men went. Pursue them quickly, for you will overtake them." But she had brought them up to the roof and hidden them among the stalks of flax, which she had laid in order on the roof. So the men pursued them on the road to Jordan, to the fords, and as soon as those who were pursuing them had gone out, they shut the gate. Now therefore, before they lay down, she came up to them on the roof and said to the men, "I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that the terror of you has fallen on us, and that all of the inhabitants of the land have melted away before you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites, who were beyond the Jordan, both to Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. And when we heard of it, our hearts melted, and no courage remained in any man any longer because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in heaven above and on earth beneath." Okay, that's the first 11 verses. Now, I want you this week and next week to focus on elements of this story and this history that are enigmas, because I think that this whole chapter is filled with a whole variety of enigmas. What are enigmas? You know, I wanted to get the technical definition from Mr. Webster, and it says it's a thing that is mysterious, puzzling, and hard to understand, an apparent paradox, an apparent contradiction which is in fact true. That's an enigma. And I'm going to suggest there's a lot of them here. Now, Rahab, of course, is an Amorite woman. She is therefore a Gentile. And we're told very plainly that she's a prostitute.
Well, you know, Josephus refers to her as an innkeeper.
That is true, except the New Testament refers to her as a harlot. So I think that the best evidence, people have argued that, but I think the evidence is that indeed she was a prostitute. Now,
I can make the argument she was both. She was running a full-service B&B.
She was, yeah. Except we think it wasn't just the conventional B&B, you know. All right, now I want you to turn as a first example of enigma, and I want you to see how many enigmas that you can identify as we go through these 2 weeks. And I want you to turn back to Deuteronomy chapter 7, and we're going to read actually verses 2 and 3. Everybody has their outline, right?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So go back to Deuteronomy chapter 7, and we're going to read 2 and 3. Starting in 2. "And when the Lord your God shall deliver them before you, you shall defeat them. Then you shall utterly destroy them. You shall make no covenant with them, and show no favor to them. Furthermore, you shall not intermarry with them. You shall not give your daughters to their sons, nor shall you take their daughters for your sons." Here are some of the rules God set up, conditions about entering into the land. Does this seem at all odd to you in any way?
He's talking about the South tribes.
He's talking about when the Jews come into the land, this is the way they should behave.
So what's the question?
Does this seem at all odd to you?
Well, he says to destroy them, and then he tells them not to do stuff with them. If they're destroyed, then how can they do stuff with them? Or not or do or not do?
Yeah, and I think the implication there is that if they weren't destroyed, well, then they might intermarry, et cetera, et cetera. So let me ask the obvious question. Did they destroy Rahab and her family? Okay. All right. Secondly, did they make an oath with her? They did.
They made an agreement.
They made an agreement, an oath. It's a very formal oath, as a matter of fact. We'll see that next week. Thirdly, what about intermarriage? What happens to Rahab after she escapes from the wall, per the agreement, the oath, with the two spies? What happens to her then? What do we learn about her?
She's in the lineage of Jesus Christ.
Because she marries a prince of Israel called Nashon. So boom, 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 3 strikes, you're out. They have just violated the first 3 elements that God gave them. Seem a little odd to you?
What was your last question? What was the answer? You meant about Rahab. About Rahab.
She married, go ahead, Jim.
She's in the lineage of Jesus Christ. She's in the land of Jesus.
Lineage.
L-I-N-E-A-G-E. That's what it is. Okay.
Yes.
All right. Okay. What is that?
Genealogy. Now, the question, and I'm not going to ask you to answer it right now. I want you to pay attention to these things. But the question we need to be asking ourselves as we look at these is, why does God do it this way? It's a very interesting question. I hope eventually by at least the end next week, we'll come up with some answers about it.
Wasn't it an attempt to keep the Jewish race pure?
Yes, it was. And it was also an attempt to reduce the possibility of idolatry. But the interesting thing, again, is in the case of Rahab and her family, because it's not just she who is saved. Her mother, her father, her other relatives, she asked for them also to have safe passage too. And they all go and live with the nation of Israel. And we know, at least in Rahab's case, they do intermarry with the Jews. Okay, now, so we're going to see, as we go through this tonight and also next week, how these principles are followed in this chapter. Now, the first thing is that they come to her brothel because apparently it's an easier place to blend in. They're not going to come allegedly spying out the city and, set up camp in the town square where everyone can see them. They're going to find some place that's more inconspicuous. And certainly we can well assume, because we know that it is a brothel, that there's a fair amount of traffic going on here. So they kind of use the high traffic nature of this to try to blend in. Now, one of the questions that I find very interesting, and if you read commentators, it's really quite interesting to do, because they almost fall all over themselves about the story. They really have a hard time with this. They really do. And of course, one of the questions is, why would God use this type of woman?
Why not?
Some people, as commentators, as you read the commentators, and I read a bunch of them, are actually, I think, rather embarrassed about this story. It almost seems very unholy, like, why is God dealing with these people? Why would he do that? It doesn't show much, godliness somehow, or holiness. Pardon? It does show mercy. Turn, if you would, to Matthew 21.
If we agree she's a prostitute.
Yes, but like I said, the New Testament says she is.
Josephus and even earlier writings say she was just referred to as an innkeeper.
But,
Okay.
again, I think we're trying to whitewash the obvious, and I think and this is what I'm trying to point out to you, why this is the case. There's a reason why God does this. I think there's a lot of reasons why God does. But turn to Matthew 21 first. Matthew 21:31. This is one of the parables of the kingdom. Verse 31. He says, talking about this parable of the vineyard and the sons and all this, he says, which of the two did the will of his father? They said the latter. Jesus said to them, truly I say to you that the tax gatherers and harlots will get into the kingdom of heaven before you.
Because the next one.
Because God,
They did believe.
yes, because they did believe. You know, the harlots did believe them. And you seeing this, okay, you obviously didn't. So there's a desire sometimes in the heart of those type of, quote, sinners that actually causes them to seek forgiveness. Turn from Matthew over to Luke chapter 15. Here's another thing. Verse 1. Now all the tax gatherers and the sinners were coming near him to listen to him. You really weren't being a very good rabbi if you allowed this, because you were supposed to exclude yourself from these people, not be tainted by these people. Jesus encouraged it. Okay, so he did exactly the opposite. If you look in James 2:24 through 26, you also see another interesting thing. James tells us about Rahab, which is quite striking, I think. He says, you see that a man is justified by works and not by faith alone. And in the same way, was not Rahab the harlot also justified by works, when she received the messengers and sent them out by another way? Keep that in mind as we go through the story. Keep in mind what James says here. Was she not justified by her works when she received the messengers and sent them out another way? And then, of course, he goes on and finishes that. But he equates her faith to the faith of Abraham in verse 21. Now think about that. He equates her faith to the faith of Abraham. Matter of fact, in Hebrews 11, in this famous chapter about the Hall of Fame of Faith, who do we find in there? Verse 31. Rahab, who is forever memorialized in the Scriptures for her faithfulness. Isn't it interesting? Now, I think the reason is this. You don't have to turn if you want to. But let me turn, and you know this passage, but I'll remind you of it. In Romans 3, he says, what then, Paul says, are we better than they? Speaking of the Gentiles. Not at all. For we have already charged or accused that both Jews and Greeks are all under sin. For it is written, there is none righteous, not even one. And then he goes on and continues. So Rahab is us. Rahab is a sinner like we're sinners. Rahab made mistakes like we've made mistakes. And this is one of the wonderful things, as Robin said, because the story is about grace. But it's not, and we're gonna get into some sticky wickets here tonight. It is not about justice. And keep this in mind. It's about grace, but it's not about justice. Not in the truest sense.
Isn't grace the opposite of justice?
No, it's not the opposite. But grace allows for things that justice in its rigidity has a hard time with. And that's, I think, one of the things we're going to learn, hopefully, from this chapter. Now, first of all, let's ask an obvious question. That is, why did Joshua send 2 spies, and why did he send them secretly?
Because he didn't want to have the same effect like Moses has with 12 spies.
Right.
When Sam came and said, we can't do that, and only 2 said, yes, we can do it.
Exactly. He didn't want to risk the same situation, so there was no point in sending 10 unfaithful ones, so he only sent 2. I think there's another reason why he also sent 2.
And together with Caleb.
Of the 2 spies, correct, Joshua and Caleb. And I think there's another reason here. I'm going to read it to you in Deuteronomy chapter 17.
He wanted a second opinion.
Not exactly. But in Deuteronomy 17, verse 6, it says, on the evidence of 2 witnesses or 3 witnesses, and then he goes on and talks about evidence as a witness. In other words, God starts the principle early on that it takes 2 witnesses to confirm something. Okay? The interesting thing is what actually was being confirmed here. And that's one of the questions we have to answer in this chapter. What was really being confirmed here?
Well, nothing.
Well, something.
That they are anxious and terrified by hearing
Yes,
of Jews.
they are. Now notice one thing as you read this chapter. One of the other things that struck me about this chapter is I read it through multiple times. It really offers no useful military information. Of all the things that you would think spies would have done, none of them are mentioned. He didn't come back and tell them the thickness of the walls. He didn't tell them the approximate number of people inside. He didn't tell them the approximate height. He didn't say what the troop strength was inside the king of Jericho's troops. He didn't say what their armaments. He didn't say any of that. There isn't one single element, really, of useful military information that's gained by these 2. Is there? But they found out something quite different. But it wasn't military.
Moral situation. Moral.
They found a number of interesting. We'll talk more about them here in a minute. Now, let's ask some questions about Rahab. Now, I'm not saying in asking these questions that we can be absolutely certain what the truth is, but I think they're useful to ask and see if indeed there might be some indication. First of all, how old do you think Rahab must have been?
We had some discussion here.
My wife and I had some discussion about this. What's your guess?
Your discussion was she was past childbearing age, so how could she have offspring?
No. Tim says that she was reasonably young, probably, and I say, well, probably she was just an old harlot.
Yeah, her argument was she just was an old prostitute.
Well, for serving for like a nursing home.
That's what she said.
Well, there are such things.
Yeah.
Well, I would think she would have to be childbearing age.
Yes.
Because she was in a lineage or the.
Correct. She couldn't have conceived. And
childbearing age go up to, let's say.
Well, probably the reasonable age that most people would live, if they're just an average person, might well be, 50-some years old. Certainly the last, not now the last century. The last century is not the 20th century, but in the 19th century, I think the median age for people in this country for length of life was about 54 years.
Yeah.
Not until tremendous advancements in technology, actually, people could be considerably older. So, like you said, Jan, we know she had to have been of childbearing age, or when she married Nahshon, she had a child. So she couldn't have been, let's just pick a number, just for the sake of having it, okay?
20.
I doubt whether she could have been over 40 years of age. Now, I can't prove that, but I think the implication of some of the things we know about her would seem to indicate that probably she's of that age. Now,
That she was old enough to be able to afford a place for people to stay.
yes, she was. Now, if we agree that she's at least reasonably young, how did she know so specifically what God had done 40 years prior in parting the Red Sea? Because remember, the two Jewish spies don't tell her this. She tells them this.
There are probably two options. One is Holy Spirit told her so. Another is someone told her so, which probably could be a member of the family.
Okay.
Or if she's running a house like this, there's going to be a lot of table talk and discussion about those Jews. Well, I heard they moved over here, and oh, did you hear?
That's a good point.
30 years ago they crossed the Red Sea and had everybody started dying, and they fought the kings, and I can hear the chatter in the bar as they're telling that story.
I absolutely believe that many, many people would have known about the battle with King Sihon and King Og, because it wasn't that much earlier. Probably, within a year, less than a year, probably months of time it occurred before they end up at Shittim here, getting close to the Jordan River. But why would she have so clearly known an event that occurred 40 years ago? Here's the thing I thought today, okay? If you think that she just has a great memory, okay, but if she's, let's say, 40 years old, how's that? Because she was probably possibly not born by the time this occurred, right? So it's almost like me saying, Gary, in October, first week of October in 1977, what was the headline in Time magazine?
Wouldn't she be shocked if he told you?
I can tell you what July the 20th, 1969 headline was.
Man walked on the moon.
Man walked on the moon, right.
And Senator Kennedy puts a car in water called checkpoint.
Yeah.
Same day.
That's the way God used her, Randy. God told her.
That's a possibility.
I think she was in tune with the hierarchy of the city of Jericho. She probably had a lot of friends in the higher places that came over to have lunch.
Well, if it was anything like Washington D.C., you might quite be right about that. Go to have your pizza, and no, we won't go there anyway.
Well, Joshua knew to go to her house for some reason.
Well, it isn't that Joshua knew, because
Joshua and Caleb, the spies, they went there.
well, the two spies are two other men. They're not named.
Maybe when
We don't know who they are.
when she heard
Yeah,
about it.
you're confusing Joshua and Caleb. This is who Moses sent.
Yeah.
The land.
That's
Yeah, I know,
They
but
were the two spies that came back.
well, I got it. It's a side note. One of the spies possibly Caleb. It could have been Caleb.
But we don't know
It
that.
could have, but again, I don't know if I would have sent a 110-year-old man to go do this, personally to reconnoiter allegedly, and to, but again, the point is we can't absolutely know some of these things, but I think it's provocative to ask them, and I like what Robin said.
Gold star.
God told her.
I think that there is evidence that this woman, well, I'll go on, okay? Now, how could she conclude, quote, the Lord is God of heaven above and earth beneath? Do you think that was a standard of the idolatrous nature of those in Jericho? Oh, yeah, the Lord Yahweh, he's,
I mean, you cannot announce that out other than being led by Holy Spirit.
When she heard about the miracles and stuff, maybe that caused her to believe.
Or another option is that she probably was very smart and wanted to save her family, therefore she knew what probably would happen, so she tried to just save her family by saying that.
but she makes a very specific statement to them. I know that the Lord is God above, in heaven above, and on earth beneath. She has some kind of understanding about the true nature of God. She knows how extensive his effect is. It's really quite interesting what she says.
She's a believer.
She is, I think. That's the interesting thing, I think. Now, here's another one.
Okay, wait a minute. Okay, so how did she know?
We just said, I think that it was revealed to her somehow. And I think that she was
How?
by the Lord somehow.
So in other words, what I said about Holy Spirit told her, is that correct?
I think that is a very good option.
Is there something wrong?
No.
Yeah.
I think the Holy Spirit confirmed, but I still going to go back. The position of Jericho, geographically, was on the highway that people travel.
Yes?
So after Egypt was destroyed, when Pharaoh's army was destroyed, you know there had to be some people coming up that highway in the next year or two saying, did you hear what happened in Egypt? Did you hear that Pharaoh drowned in the Red Sea? Did you hear that the entire country is upside down and the economy's in the dumpster? Did you hear about the battle? So I could see that human chain as people are talking about what had happened, what is happening, and then the Holy Spirit says, yep, this is the truth.
It could be. It could be. Let me ask another one, okay? Why is she so willing to help them upon threat of death by the king of Jericho?
The devil in the deep blue sea. One, if God had really told her, had revealed it, that she knew his will was going to happen, and she needs to put her bet on that side of the table because Jericho will be destroyed.
I agree.
I agree too.
God, then she trusted God, so she had faith.
Yes, and again, back to James 2, what James said about her, faith without works is dead, being by itself.
Mm-hmm.
I think all these things together make me believe that she
Was chosen.
that she was chosen long ago by God's sovereign will,
Just like Ruth was.
just like Ruth, and just like many Gentiles that somehow God sovereignly picked, and they became, like Paul said, there are believers by birth and there are believers by faith. She became a believer by faith and not by birth. She became part of national Israel. So I think it's very interesting how she may have been affected. Now let me ask a few further interesting questions about Rahab. Okay? Or I'm sorry, a few interesting things about her. That is, I entitled this under G, if you look on the outline, Rahab the Liar. First, she states that she has no idea who these two spies are or where they come from. That's a bold-faced lie.
That's correct.
Because we're told in the text she does know where they come from, and she does know why they're there.
So she broke one of the 10 commandments.
She sure did. Number two, she states that they were at her place, but left, and she has no idea where they went. Lie number two. She knows exactly, yes, they were there, and she knows exactly where they went because she purposely sent the pursuers of the king's men the opposite direction. Okay? Absolutely opposite of where the Jews were actually going. Now, thirdly, she intentionally deceives the king's men by hiding the spies and sending them away the wrong direction. It brings up a very interesting question that I think we have to consider in many elements through this story. One of them is there justification for lying?
Yes, I believe it is. I think of end times, if we were here for end times, chances are you're going to have to lie to survive, probably.
Well, or you could simply accept dying. I guess that would be another possibility.
It depends on what you're lying about. But she was called by
Okay.
God to do something specifically, so I don't like to carry out what God told her to do.
Now, one of the commentators says about that line of reasoning, that's a justification because God could have somehow, miraculously spared the two spies whether she told the king of Jericho's men or not. That was one comment. I don't happen to agree with him, but, people are uncomfortable about the fact that this woman lied. Because, they point out all kinds of bearing false witness. They point out all of these elements and say, but lying's wrong. And it is morally wrong.
Well, I'm not uncomfortable about her lying.
Okay?
Because
Here's what...
Even back, should we go over where they protected those people in Amsterdam, that house?
I think Anne Frank's house.
Yeah,
Anne
Anne Frank's house. You have Corey ten Boom also in Holland. You have people that specifically took in Jews to protect them, and in the process lied over and over again to the Nazis, and got a hold of illegal food cards, ration cards, so they could eat. They deceived, they lied, and they stole. Right?
Yeah.
So the question is, are they right or wrong?
They were doing the right thing against evil.
And again, I would agree with that. But I think you're going to find a very large number of people that are not going to agree with that. And they're going to say, this deceiving is wrong and lying is wrong. Let me give you another one here.
It
It
is.
is wrong.
It frustrates
It
me
is
when
bad.
someone lies to me. But you have to consider, why did that person lie?
Okay?
And this
Now-
is one thing, and then secondly, do we lie? I think I don't, but I'm certain I do sometimes, or it's not maybe my intention to.
Turn to 1 Peter chapter 2. Let's look at this concept a little bit further. 1 Peter chapter 2. You there?
Yes.
1 Peter chapter 2. I'm going to read 13, 14. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether to a king as the one in authority or to governors as sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and the praise of those who do right. For such is the will of God, that by doing right you may silence the ignorance of foolish men. Seems like a rather blunt prohibition against disobeying authority, doesn't it? And yet what did Rahab do?
Well, I guess
She blatantly
we must
disobeyed.
make choices sometimes. And
These questions in this chapter really bothers a lot of people. You can even see it in the commentators as you read. It bothers them because they say, lying is always wrong. And you start to ask yourself, if lying is always wrong in every circumstance, then why would God take a threefold liar here and put her in the Hall of Fame of faith?
Well, let's say lie most of the time is wrong.
Okay.
Is that correct?
You see why I'm saying this is a chapter of enigmas? God seems to break the rules over and over again in this chapter.
But who a weird question got?
I'm sorry?
Who a weird question got?
Yeah, I think when you really get down to it, here's what my conclusion is about this chapter. The chapter is not about right and wrong, and it is not fundamentally about morality, but rather it's a chapter that's about grace, and that in view of grace, at times, God, number one, doesn't follow his own rules, in a sense, and secondly, sometimes in view of grace, we need to bend a few of them also. Because if we don't, and we view the world and the actions of people as either absolutely right or absolutely wrong, then we become judgmental and incapable of being flexible enough maybe to demonstrate a grace where we should.
I see what you're saying. It was a good example with those Nazis and people who say Jews. Yeah, it was a good
There's always a gray area.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Ray had too, she was obeying a law of God, I think, over the law of man that was going to hurt these two spies.
I think she was obeying the will of God, not necessarily the law of God. Because the law of God she was breaking in the most technical sense. But I agree with, she was absolutely
Because she
following
lied
the will of
and
God.
she was disobedient to
Yeah,
her authority.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Of course, it also brings up this question, and it's not that important, I guess, but I said, would the fact that this involves a future military campaign have any effect on the issue of her lying? Can you imagine trying to prosecute a war by telling the truth all the time?
Can we imagine what?
Can you imagine trying to prosecute a war by always telling the truth? Well, what are you supposed to do? Send out private troop movement communications over the internet so that everyone on the planet can read it?
We have to be sneaky and more to
Why is it we spent so much time in code breaking in World War II, both of Japanese and German code? Why did they encode? Were they deceiving? Of course they were.
This is kind of a different avenue, but what about when we have little kids and you tell them about Santa Claus and the future?
Now you went on thin ice.
And you try to make them believe that Jesus did anything before.
Well, I will say this, though, in what you just said, Jan. Do you take a child in some area, let's say in explaining human sexuality, and try to explain everything that you know about that thing in that area to them?
Right. Yeah. No. I see what you're saying.
See?
Yeah.
You could be more forthcoming,
Yeah.
but you're making a judgment, aren't you?
Yeah.
The judgment is, I don't think they're ready for this.
Right.
So I'm going to make it real kind of vanilla for them at this age, and at a later age, they probably can handle additional truth about this.
What if lying is wrong, but it's when you feel that you're doing it for the right reasons, even godly reasons, then God doesn't say, oh, it's okay then, but he understands because of your intent, your motive.
Well,
intent.
I think,
Is
again,
that what makes it maybe right or wrong too?
I think that you make another good point, and that is, the bottom line, I think, is this. Every one of us, probably from time to time, is faced with a real dilemma. Something comes up that there's not an easy solution to. We struggle with it and think, should I say this? Should I say that? What if I say this as opposed to that? What are the possible consequences of telling them this? We have these sticky areas that can occur. And then we must make a thoughtful, prayerful judgment. This is what I believe I'm allowed or supposed to say in this situation. It may not be completely forthcoming. But in that case, being completely forthcoming might be destructive. So,
Hey, like you said, if they would, quote, enemies would come to me and ask me, do you know where your husband is? And you know, but you don't want to tell them, would you lie?
that's the question I asked her when we were going on about lying, because she was saying, it's wrong, it's wrong. And so I asked her that question. She goes, I lie.
Unless she was angry.
That's right. And then, that's right. He's in the closet. Go get him.
Well, you have to look at why a person even lies to begin with. Are they trying to get out of something? They don't want somebody to know something about
That's
them?
what, like you said, yeah.
But
You don't
somehow,
want to hurt somebody's feelings or something.
yeah.
That's That's a tough one. I mean, seriously. Like someone fixes or something, which I hate.
Yes.
It's like I asked Gary, what how does this look on me? Sometimes he lies.
No, you never have to just make my butt look good.
It's really been a beautiful day.
That's right.
You learn quick.
That's right. Yes. Being too forthcoming at times is not good for one's health.
So coming back to,
So it's okay to lie every now and then if it's right.
well, if
For the right
let's
reason.
say an old lady fixed me something which I really hate to eat, like you know, like I don't know, whatever. What am I? And she said, "Well, how was that, dear? What am I supposed to say?"
Well, I love that.
Not my favorite.
I just
You know what?
loved it.
There you go.
No. You say, thank you very much for fixing it for me. It doesn't
No,
say
I
how I
can't.
like it.
Well,
You know, kids are
if I would say that to you, would you understand that
Yes.
I didn't like it?
Yes.
Yeah, but,
Okay,
you know, that
I
you would
don't-
say, would you like some more?
Michael, you wouldn't either.
No.
Let me give you an example of disobedience. Okay? And, you know,
If you need to do that, we all.
Yeah, that's true. It's Acts chapter 5. I'm going to read it to you. This is about Peter and I think it was John, if I'm not mistaken.
5:27?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Says, and when they stood them, and when they had brought them, they stood them before the council, which means the Sanhedrin, the legal body in Israel at that point, right? And the high priest cautioned them, saying, we gave you strict orders not to continue teaching in this name, that is the name of Jesus. And behold, you have filled Jerusalem with your teaching and intend to bring this man's blood upon us. In other words, if you keep doing this and you keep creating riotous situations, the Romans are going to come in and put their boots in our face. You know, you're making a very difficult situation here for us. Don't talk about this Jesus. Verse 29, and Peter and the apostles answered and said, we must obey God rather than men. And that's his answer. They were still a legal authority in Israel. But there was a higher authority that they were serving in this particular case. And that's why they didn't obey them.
So the bottom line is the general line of policy of the authorities is the same as God's, and we obey. It's not
Yes.
we disobey, or we don't have to obey.
Now,
So if you do something wrong, which is not by God's way, I can disobey you. Is that correct?
yes. Let's go back
Probably didn't.
and read a
You
few.
want my gold star?
Let's go back and read a few more verses, and then we'll stop for tonight.
10:11?
Okay? I'm going to read starting verse 7 again. So the men pursued them on the road. This is the king's men. Pursued them on the road to the Jordan and to the fords. And as soon as those who were pursuing them had gone out, they shut the gate. Now therefore, they lay down. Now before they lay down, she came up to them on the roof, and she covered them in flax. This was the time of the flax harvest. And in flax harvest during this time, they would cut flax into about 4-foot lengths, and they would soak it in water for days to soften it, and then they would go and lay it out on their rooftops to dry by the heat of the day. So I'm certain there's lots of people had flax on their roof at this time. So it wouldn't be uncommon. It wouldn't stand out that she had flax on her roof. And she hides them among the flax so that they can't be found. And she said to the men, verse 9, I know that the Lord has given you this land, and that the terror of you has fallen on us, and that all the inhabitants of the land have melted away before you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. This is the one important piece of information they got from Rahab. As the 2, and I prefer almost to call them witnesses. That is, that God has prepared the land and prepared the people of the land to be in terror and fear. And he's already sent that among the Canaanites, so that all the Jews have to do is start to act in the way in which he wants them to militarily, and these people will not withstand the Jews. That's what she...
That the Lord, their God, is God.
Exactly. You know, isn't it interesting that she has an unbelievably good concept of who the infinite, personal, powerful God is in the world, coming from a Canaanite pagan culture, and yet she knows.
A powerful testimony.
Yeah, a powerful testimony, absolutely.
You know, whatever Rahab's profession was, she was smart, shrewd, intelligent, cunning, and insightful.
Yes, she was.
Mm-hmm.
All of those things.
Mm-hmm.
Now, next week, we're going to learn what she asked the spies to do and what the spies agreed to do. And we're going to see elements about that that are really quite interesting, the last half of this chapter. So,
It was very interesting.
okay?
I have many questions.
And I didn't bring much tonight, but I've got cookies, I've got raisin, I've got chocolate chips, I've got peanut butter, I've got chips from Gaya,
When the last...
and some garlic cheese and
Yeah.
sounds like a lot.
Yeah.